The names in the lockbox. Daniel had asked to meet his daughter's future in-laws 4 times, and 4 times Sophie had found a reason why it couldn't happen yet. The first time, it was scheduling. Marcus's parents were traveling. The second time, his mother had a migraine. The third time, Sophie simply changed the subject so smoothly that Daniel didn't notice he'd been redirected until an hour later, replaying the conversation in his car. The fourth time, she'd looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen since she was 16 and had wrecked the car and hidden it for 3 days. Not guilt, exactly. Calculation. That was the moment Daniel understood his daughter was hiding something, and that whatever it wasn't small. He was 61 years old, 2 years a widower, and he had spent most of those 2 years trying not to be the kind of father who asked too many questions. Alina had been the one who asked questions. Alina had been the one who noticed things, a catch in someone's voice, a lie shaped like a joke, the half-second delay before an answer that meant the answer had been rehearsed. Daniel had spent 34 years of marriage letting his wife do that work, while he did the steadier, quieter work of being reliable. Now she was gone, and the noticing had fallen to him, and he was bad at it. But even he could see this. "I just want to meet them, Soph," he'd said the last time, standing in her kitchen while she rearranged a spice rack that did not need rearranging. Before the wedding, that's not an unreasonable thing for a father to want. "I know, Dad," she hadn't turned around, "it's complicated." "How complicated can meeting 2 people be?" "You'll meet them, just not yet, please, trust me on this one." And because she'd said please, and because grief had made him more conflict-averse than he used to be, he had let it go. For 3 more weeks, he let it go. Then he found the lockbox. He hadn't been looking for it. He'd been looking for tax documents from 4 years back, because the accountant needed something about a property sale Alina had handled before her diagnosis, and Daniel had been putting off going through her old file cabinet for exactly the reason you'd expect. It still smelled like her perfume, faintly, under the mustiness of old paper, and every time he opened a drawer, he felt like he was trespassing on a woman who could no longer tell him to get out. The tax documents were in the 3rd drawer, as expected. The lockbox was underneath them, which was not expected, because Daniel had never seen it before in his life. It was small, steel, the kind of thing you'd buy at an office supply store to keep passports and birth certificates safe from fire. It had a combination lock instead of a key. Daniel sat on the floor of what used to be Alina's home office, surrounded by 34 years of a marriage's worth of paperwork, and stared at 4 little dials, and felt something in his chest go very still and very cold. He tried her birthday. Nothing. He tried their anniversary. Nothing. He tried Sophie's birthday, and the little latch clicked open so easily it felt almost insulting, like the box had been waiting for him to be smart enough to ask the right question. Inside were 3 things. The first was a manila folder of old bank statements from an account Daniel didn't recognize, opened 19 years ago and closed 6 years later, with a balance that had never gone above $4,000 and had clearly been used to make a series of small, regular deposits and one very large withdrawal near the end. The second was a stack of letters, handwritten, none of them signed with anything more than an initial, an M, and none of them addressed to Daniel. The third was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of something official, with 2 names on it that made Daniel's hands go cold before his mind had even finished processing why. Whitfield. Richard Whitfield, Carol Whitfield. The same name Sophie had mentioned exactly once, in an unguarded moment 3 months ago, before she'd learned to be careful about it. Marcus's parents, Richard and Carol. Daniel sat very still on the floor of his dead wife's office for a long time. He didn't call Sophie that night. He told himself it was because it was late, because he needed to think, because a man doesn't call his daughter with his hands shaking and his voice unsteady and expect to have a conversation that goes anywhere good. All of that was true. But underneath it was something else, a reluctance to find out, A wish that he could put the lid back on the lockbox and pretend the last 2 hours hadn't happened. He read the letters instead, all of them twice. They were not love letters, not exactly, though there was tenderness in them, an aching kind of care that made Daniel feel like an intruder in his own memory of his marriage. They were letters between two people managing something painful together, arrangements, the letters called it, and the situation, and once, only once, in a letter dated almost 20 years back, our son. Daniel read that line perhaps a dozen times before it fully landed. I think about him constantly, more than I let myself admit even to you. I hope the Whitfields are giving him the life we couldn't. I hope he never has to know how much it cost us to give him that life. Please don't write again after this. I mean it this time. For all of us. The letter was signed, as they all were, with the single letter M. Alina's middle name had been Marie. She had never in 34 years used it, not for anything, not even to sign a check. Daniel had genuinely forgotten it was there until this exact moment, sitting on the floor with a photocopied document that appeared to be a private adoption agreement, dated 1 year before he and Alina had met. He put the letters down and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes until he saw white static. Alina had had a son before him, a son she had given up to a family named Whitfield. The same family, apparently, that his daughter was about to marry into. Daniel did not sleep that night, and by the time the sun came up, he had gone through several different versions of what this could mean, most of them worse than the one that turned out to be true. His first fear, the one that made him physically nauseated, was the obvious one, that Marcus was Alina's son, that his daughter was engaged to her own half-brother without either of them knowing it. He sat with that fear for almost an hour, doing math in his head, Marcus's age, 29, the date on the adoption document, 20 years before Sophie was even conceived, and by 6 in the morning he had roughly convinced himself the timeline fit. He called Sophie at 7:15, earlier than he ever called her, and he heard the sleep-thick alarm in her voice when she picked up. "Dad, what's wrong? I need you to come over, today, it's important." "Is it your heart? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, physically I'm fine. I need to show you something." She came at 9, still in the clothes she'd apparently thrown on without much thought, hair pulled back, worry written plainly across her face in a way she usually worked harder to hide from him. He met her at the door with the lockbox already open on the kitchen table, the letters laid out beside it like evidence in a trial he hadn't meant to conduct. "What is this?" she said, not really a question. "I was looking for tax records. I found your mother's lockbox instead." He watched her face as he said it, watched the exact moment recognition crossed it, not surprise at the box's existence, but surprise that he'd found it. "You knew about this." Sophie sat down slowly across from him, and for a long moment she didn't say anything at all. Not exactly," she finally said. "I knew there was something. Mom told me near the end. Not everything enough." "Enough for what, Sophie? Enough to hide your fiancé's parents from your own father for 6 months." "I didn't know how to tell you." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Daniel watched his 30-year-old daughter look, for a moment, exactly like the 16-year-old who'd wrecked the car. "I found out who Marcus's parents were the same week we got engaged. I recognized the name Whitfield because Mom had mentioned it once years ago when she was sick. In that way she talked sometimes near the end, when she wasn't always making sense. I didn't think anything of it until I actually met them and Carol mentioned an old adoption, mentioned it so casually, like a fact about the weather, and I froze, Dad. I didn't know what it meant. I still don't fully know what it means. I've spent 6 months trying to figure it out before I said anything to you, because I didn't want to blow up your grief with something I wasn't even sure was true." "Is Marcus," Daniel made himself say it, "is he your mother's son?" Sophie's eyes widened, real shock this time, unmistakably genuine. "What? No, God, no, Dad, no." She reached for the photocopied document, scanned it, and something in her posture loosened with relief even as her face stayed pale. Marcus is 31. This adoption is dated. She checked the date, did the math Daniel had already done. This baby would be 29. That's not Marcus. Marcus has an older sister, a sister who was adopted. The room seemed to tilt very slightly. His sister. Her name is Renee. She's 29. She was adopted as an infant. Sophie looked up at him, and now there were tears standing in her eyes, unshed, glassy. I've met her twice. She looks. Sophie stopped herself, but Daniel understood exactly what she'd almost said. She looked like someone. She looked like Alina. They sat with that for a long time, the two of them, coffee going cold between them. The letters spread across the table like the pieces of a story neither of them had asked to be handed. "So your mother," Daniel said eventually, working it out loud because he needed to hear it in his own voice to believe it, "had a daughter, before me, gave her up for adoption to a family named Whitfield. And 29 years later, that same family's son, no relation to the daughter, an unrelated sibling in the same adopted household, meets our daughter, and they fall in love and get engaged, with absolutely nobody involved having any idea that his adoptive sister is biologically connected to his fiancée's family. When you say it like that, it sounds like something off a soap opera." "It is something off a soap opera, Sophie." She almost laughed, a small broken sound, and then she was crying properly. And Daniel got up and went around the table and held his daughter the way he hadn't since Alina's funeral, both of them undone by a woman who'd been gone 2 years and had apparently never stopped keeping secrets. "I didn't know how to tell you," Sophie said again, into his shoulder. "I kept thinking, what if I tell him and it destroys how he remembers Mom? What if this is the thing that finally breaks him after everything else? I've watched you put yourself back together so carefully this past year, Dad. I didn't want to be the one who knocked it all down again." Daniel held her and thought about how much of grief was exactly this. Not one loss, but an endless unfolding of small ones, each old certainty proven eventually to have been only partly true. He had thought he knew his wife completely. 34 years, and there had been a whole chapter of her life, a daughter, a grief of her own that she had carried silently and alone for 2 decades before he'd even met her, and had apparently carried in silence straight through their entire marriage and into her own death. He was angry for a while sitting there, not at Sophie, at Alina a little for the secret, at himself for not somehow sensing it in 34 years of marriage. And then, underneath the anger, something else arrived, slower and sadder and eventually more durable. He understood. He understood a woman who'd made an impossible decision young, who'd never been able to speak of it, who had built a whole marriage and a whole second life around a wound she never let show. The letters made more sense now, reread in this light, not evidence of betrayal, but the record of a woman quietly checking, year after year, that a decision made in desperation had led somewhere good. "I hope the Whitfields are giving him the life we couldn't, except it wasn't him," Daniel now understood, correcting his own first misreading. Somewhere in the earliest of the letters, before Alina had learned to be careful even in private correspondence, she'd used the wrong pronoun once, out of habit or grief fog, and Daniel had built his worst fear on that single slip. The rest of the letters, read again, were unmistakably about a daughter. "She named her," Daniel said quietly, holding up the last letter, the earliest one, dated a full year before the adoption paperwork. "Look, before she signed the papers, she wanted her called Renee, and Sophie, the Whitfields kept it. They actually kept the name she chose." Sophie took the letter and read it, and something about that detail, the small mercy of a name honored across 29 years and total strangers, seemed to undo something tight in her chest. "So Renee is my sister," she said slowly, "half-sister. And she's about to become your sister-in-law too, if you marry her brother." "That's Dad. That's not even a weird sentence I ever thought I'd say." They both laughed, then, unsteadily, the particular laughter that arrives right alongside grief and makes room for it instead of shoving it aside. They told Marcus and Renee together, 3 days later, all four of them sitting in Daniel's living room with the lockbox on the coffee table between them like a small steel confession. Renee cried before anyone had even finished the explanation. In the specific, quiet way of someone who has spent a lifetime wondering about a biological mother and has just been handed, unexpectedly, an answer far more tender than she dared hope for. Marcus mostly sat very still, holding his sister's hand, watching Sophie with an expression Daniel recognized, because he'd worn it himself 2 nights before. The particular vertigo of discovering the person you love is connected to you in a way you never imagined, in a way that changes nothing about how you feel and everything about how you understand your own life. She thought about you every year, Daniel told Renee, sliding the stack of letters across the table toward her. There's 19 of them. She never sent a single one. I think she was too afraid of what it would do to the life you'd already built, but she never stopped writing them. Renee held the letters like they might dissolve if she gripped them too hard, and read the first one slowly, silently, her lips moving faintly over certain lines. And when she looked up, her face had the stunned, grateful look of someone who has just been given back a piece of themselves they didn't know was missing. "Can I keep these?" she asked. "They were always meant for you," Daniel said. "I think she just never found the courage to actually give them to you while she was alive. Consider this me finishing something she couldn't." Later, after Renee and Marcus had gone, after the house had gone quiet again, Sophie stayed behind and helped her father put the letters back in the lockbox. All but the ones Renee had taken, which felt right, felt like the beginning of something being returned rather than something being lost. "You're not upset with her," Sophie said, not quite a question. Daniel considered it honestly before he answered, the way Alina would have wanted him to. "I was, for about an hour. Then I thought about what it must have cost her to make that decision at 19 and then carry it alone for the rest of her life, even inside a marriage where she could have told me anything. That's not a woman who didn't trust me. That's a woman who was protecting a wound so old and so tender that she never figured out how to let anyone near it, including herself." He closed the lockbox, gently, the way you'd close something that had finally finished doing its work. "I'd rather know her more completely now, even like this, than keep believing in a version of her that wasn't the whole truth." Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder, the way she used to when she was small, before either of them had learned all the ways a family could surprise you. "So," she said after a while, a small smile finding its way back into her voice, "about this wedding, I'm going to need a very unusual seating chart." Daniel laughed, really laughed, for what felt like the first time in months, and put his arm around his daughter, and thought that somewhere, Alina was probably laughing too, relieved, finally, of a secret that had turned out in the end not to break anything at all, but only to make the family a little larger and a little more honestly whole than either of them had known to expect.